this evening. I'm giving a speech this evening in connection with selecting your topic. It's from the Better Speaker series in the Toastmasters. So, what is it about and why is it important? Well, first of all, a bit of an introduction to you. I'm Jimmy Fitzpatrick and I have been a Toastmaster for the past 6 years. To the stalwarts of the club, they're going, he's only a young fella. But to our guests here this evening and people who have just joined us, they're thinking, well, that's an achievement. And yes, it is. It's fantastic to achieve 6 years here at the club. The purpose mainly of my presentation here this evening is to introduce fellow Toastmasters, and in particular our guests and people who are new to the club, to how you select appropriate material for a topic and ultimately to give a speech. So, again, this presentation is part of the Better Speaker series which I'm working from. So it sets out how to prepare your speech and what's involved and ultimately your approach and how you approach can vary hugely. That being said, there's levels throughout Toastmasters of speeches. It can be the icebreaker. For the guests here this evening, the icebreaker is the very first speech you will make when you begin speaking at Toastmasters. And the purpose of the icebreaker speech is ultimately to begin speaking in front of an audience. But then you can also be a distinguished Toastmasters where you have 50 speeches underneath your belt and you have great accomplishment of how to deliver and articulate speeches. You have a personal situation which might dictate the topic of your speech, and this could be that you're very confident and you like giving speeches, or that you're of a quiet demeanour and you want to put yourself out there and begin doing speeches. And of course, your attitude. Well, why ultimately you want to take this on board is because you want to achieve something and to be able to stand in front of the audience and your attitude towards that. So, without further ado, there are two main sources of information where and how we can get our information to deliver a speech. So we're going to look at these two sources of information separately. The first one here this evening is personal experience. Can you see there okay? Yes. So let's look at 4 or 5 points from personal experience and see how we can get a speech from personal experiences. The first one I would like to talk about this evening is interests. We would encourage anyone that's doing their icebreaker speech to, not let's get personal, but to talk about something they're very familiar with. And we all have an interest. We are all here this evening, so we have an interest in Toastmasters. So you could ultimately have a speech on Toastmasters. Another point would be your career. You're very familiar with what you do, so why not speak about it? I spoke a couple of years ago about a cost speech, and it was about how we cost things. Now, apart from boring people to death, ultimately it was, briefly, I live out in a local rural village, and in the local shop at the time, the price of milk was €3. But my mum insisted on driving the 10 kilometres into Portlaoise because actually it was only €2. But when I sat down with my mum to explain costings, I said, yes mum, you are ultimately saving €1. But again, you get the car out and you drive to Portlaoise, you get the milk and you drive back, you've probably wasted €5. So then she was going, oh well, I never thought of it. So that's when I say your career can dictate how you make a speech. Another source would be your family. We all have family. We all have brothers and sisters and parents and uncles and aunts, and we can talk about them. This Christmas, as a gift to myself, because no one else wanted to give me a Christmas present, I signed up for Ancestry.com. Okay. And I have found that I have hundreds and hundreds of cousins that I have never heard of. But they are all out there. And that is certainly a speech I will be given for another night. Because, believe it or not, there was 1 or 2 surprises. Another aspect is your education. And we all have some form of education, be it primary, secondary, or third level education. And how we adapt that to our daily lives. I've currently gone back to, I'm a qualified accountant by trade, and I've gone back to college to be a forensic accountant. And last week I was doing interviewing a girl called Jean, and there was misappropriation of funds to the value of 450,000. She was the sole person in charge of the purchase ledger who'd signed off all the documentation and given out the purchase orders, but yet knew nothing about the alleged fraud in the company or the misappropriation of the funds. So that was quite interesting, and it did certainly challenge me. Again, that's another speech for another night. Where are we next? Your accomplishments. What have you accomplished in life that you're proud of? If I told you I was a great swimmer when I was younger, and I went on to represent Ireland on the world stage, that's not true. And that is not a speech for another night, that is simply a fabrication. But what I will tell you is that I'd say the truth is I was a very accomplished swimmer. And I went in 2011 to Australia, and I did what everyone that goes to Australia did, was I swam the Barrier Reef. And the guide we had at the time thought it would be hilarious to quite simply throw, while I was snorkeling, he threw a slice of bread onto my back. Now, you'd have to imagine the situation. I was in the water snorkeling, and a shoal of fish jumped on top of me. I mean, not just like 10 or 20, these were 1,000 fish. And to this day, even though I have taken swimming lessons again and everything, I've just lost the ability to swim. My confidence completely went there and then in that 5 minutes, and I have never been able to just get back to, they say once you start swimming, you never forget, but I just couldn't get back to it. So that's, when you talk about accomplishments, it's something very simple. Someone that could swim, now can't. So, the other side, that's the personal experience. So the other side would be referenced material. So I suppose as you would get more advanced through your speeches, you would use referenced materials to look up and, make your speeches, I suppose, more developed. So, what are referenced materials? We have websites. Everybody looks up a website at home. You could be looking at Dundee or HSE now with, the COVID-19 virus. We reference it. And a lot of the time, it's very accurate material is on it if you choose the official websites. So that's what you can rely on for your reference materials websites. We also have books. They say books don't lie. You can use quotes from various authors or poets or anyone that you have an interest in referencing throughout your speeches. Magazines, and as we call them rags or trade magazines. We have our very own Toastmaster magazines, and that comes out once a month, and there's loads of articles in there that you can read up on and ultimately use throughout your speeches here at Toastmasters. And or as Martina mentioned there at the beginning, she'll be using cutouts from various papers which will form part of our topics later on in the meeting. Newspapers, again, we look at the headlines every day. They say the newspapers don't lie, a lot of them do. It is concerning headlines we read at the weekend, for example, about the COVID-19. 180,000 people can be affected quite quickly with this coronavirus. So, is it scare tactics? Is it real? Is it fact or fiction? We just don't know it at this time. So they are some of the reference materials. Of course, now in recent years we have social media. And as they say, they don't spare the ink on social media, and you can ultimately Google anything or look at anything, and it's quite warm in here, so I'm kind of sweating. You can look up anything you want on social media, and that's Instagram, that's Facebook, it's Google, it's whatever you want it to be. So, again, just to iterate, they are the two main sources of information that you can get your speeches and develop them from there. So, what makes a good speech? Certainly not me this evening. But look, you need to get inspired. You need to ultimately decide what you want to speak about. That's why I chose this subject this evening, because I want to tell people and I want to be an advocate of what makes a good speech. So, you narrow your selection. There's no point in being very vague and waffling and telling a load of data and no information. So you need to narrow in your selection. You need to know your audience, which is quite important. That can be age, that can be content, or it can be dynamic. So if you're addressing a group of senior people, they're not going to know what TBH is, or Insta, or social media and Facebook. They won't be up to date on that. So you have to direct your speech that it's appropriate to your audience. The occasion also is very important. Be it again your icebreaker, your first ever speech in Toastmasters, or if you're delivering a speech at work, that's ultimately going to be different. Ties back into knowing your audience. Or if you're addressing the nation, which, you know, Mr. Houlihan from the HSE is on the evening news. He doesn't want to create hysteria with COVID-19. He has to be very clear and precise and factual. He doesn't want to be going, well, maybe now there is, I think there was a case there in the South today. It's all about fact for him doing his speech. Know your abilities as well. Are you an expert in the field? There is no point in giving information if you are not an expert and that you cannot stand over this information. So don't go on about something if ultimately there's a question and answer speech at the end and you are going to not know the answers to those questions, because it will unveil you as pretty much a fraud. Use appropriate wording. Certainly if you're given a speech at work and it is work related and everybody understands the terminology, that's fine. But if you have an audience that are not familiar with engineering words, well then they're going to be lost. So you have to use wording that they're familiar with and ultimately spell out what you mean by the words. Be specific. Again, getting back to our evening news on COVID-19, is it fact or is it fiction? I believe a good speech is like a happy marriage. You have a beginning. We all ultimately fall in love and want to get married, and it's all great at the beginning. We have the body where we have the experience of life together, and then we have a conclusion where we can look back on our life and say, well, we did this and we achieved that, or, you know, very similar to a speech. Start off, explain what the speech is about, what you're doing, look at the body of it, fill it out, and ultimately marry back in the conclusion and say, from the end, how it goes back to the beginning. Enjoy when you're given a speech and add a bit of humour to it. Try and keep your audience captive. I'm going to tell you that marriage is also like a deck of cards. Quite simple, a deck of playing cards. In the beginning, it's all diamonds and hearts. In the end, all you need is a club and a spade. I'm Jimmy Fitzpatrick, and we are all champions of our faith. So get on the Pathways programme and start a new experience in Toastmasters. Like I say, we're all champions.
Okay,
Thank you very much for your attention this week.